Hello, my name is Andrew or Andrey. Today I will try to talk to show something about Power BI and how you can use it in a programmatic way to interact with it. This is my session. First, a few words about me. I would like to say that I'm not a DBA or Power BI guy. I'm a software developer. I write code. Databases, Power BI, SQL Server, etc. are more like a hobby to me. Sometimes I do support and manage SQL Server instances of some of my clients, but in general, I don't do that. This is my contact information. If you have any comments, any feedback, questions, or just want to say hi, do not hesitate to contact me. I would love to hear you. So, what is Power BI? Power BI is a visualization tool. It's also a data analysis tool. It's a website. It's a Power BI desktop application. It's a mobile application, but this is just the tip of the iceberg, only the visible part of a huge infrastructure that is working behind the scenes to support all of that. But this is all interactive. It's designed for people to work with. The user who will open his browser and load the report to check, did we manage to become a billionaire yesterday or not? What if we want to manage this programmatically in some non-interactive way? For example, to create a set of reports programmatically from our system when we register a new reseller and we want to create a set of reports especially for him, or simply want to refresh some data sets right after our ETS jobs completes and not wait for some predefined moment in time to do this automatically. Fortunately, we have the right tool for that job in our hands, and this is the Power BI REST API. The Power BI REST API is a REST-based API that provides programmatic access to Power BI resources such as datasets, tables, rows, styles, etc. It provides service endpoints that you can interact with to perform various operations. You can create new data sets. You can enumerate the tables in some data set, or you can push rows to some table. You can manage workspaces and many, many other things that you can do with the Power BI REST API. In this session, I will focus on the REST API for the Power BI service itself. It's good to know that in general, Power BI service and Power BI embedded, these are two separate sets of APIs on different endpoints. But in general, the way of interacting with the embedded API is similar. So if you are interested of developing embedded applications to embed Power BI in your applications, you will get the idea, and it's a matter of studying the documentation. So how we can use the Power BI REST API? What do we need to utilize this API? First, we need to authenticate ourselves. After all, we won't be happy if some anonymous user can push arbitrary data to your data set, right? The reports in this case won't be very trustworthy. To do this, we are using authentication against Azure Active Directory. Almost every REST API call requires so-called access token that we're getting from there. After we're successfully authenticated our identity and we get this access token, we will put it in the request headers that we're calling these endpoints. How we can do this? Let's start with some demos. We will write one very simple application. It has only one button. When we click it, we will get authenticated against the Azure Active Directory, and we will get our access token. First, I would like to remind you that everything you see will be just little demo programs, and the little demo programs does little or no error checking at all. When you write a production code, you should take care of some error handling, logging, retrying logic, etc. I will not do this in the demos to keep them simple and easy to understand the basic idea. So you've been warned, take care of this when you use the demos, but now let's write our simple application. When we are about to authenticate ourselves against Azure Active Directory, we can do this using one NuGet package from Microsoft, namely Microsoft Identity Model Clients Active Directory. So we will install these NuGet packages, one package, for our application. This is how you can start. After this package is installed, we can start using it. First, we will need to declare some stuff that we will need. And these are the redirect URL, which is something that is used during the authentication process. The resource URL, which is what API will be used, will be protected by this access token, and the authority URL, which is used, which is given us by the authority who will authorize us. And we will need something called client ID. This is a unique identifier for our application. It is used to identify the application. It will appear in our tenant's Azure Active Directory. And from there, we can manage the access for this application. To get this, we need to go to Dev Power BI Com Apps, sign in with our existing account, fill some stuff like the name of our application, what kind it is. In our demo, we will make a native application, which means, for example, a Windows application or Linux, Android, whatever. Or if we are making a server-side web application, it's used when we are making web applications. The difference is very small. Only you have one thing to enter more for the web applications. It's the home page of the web applications where you will go. So we have to enter this redirect URL, which is a constant that we should use to validate our Microsoft ID identification. And we have to select what APIs our application will access and will use. Then the only thing we should do is to register our application. Okay, I have to log in again because we wait too much. So I will have to type the name of the application again. This is a credential that I will use to register. And we are waiting. Okay. Power BI days 2018, for example. We are making a native application. And as I said, we have to copy this redirect URL specified here. We're specifying which APIs our application will use. For example, I will check all of them and register application. This GUID is the unique identifier for our application. We need it in our code, so I will paste it here. The next thing that we need is to perform the actual authentication. So let's write some code. We're creating the so-called authentication context, which is a class or object that acts as a client for authenticating against Azure Active Directory. And we will use methods of that class to perform the actual authentication. And because we will use the async versions of this, I will simply make my method async because I will waiting. And as you see, these resources that I declared are passed to the as parameters to acquire token async method or to the authentication context class. Now we're getting this method called, and we will try to authenticate ourselves against Azure Active Directory. I hope everything will work properly, and at the end, we will get our access token. We are clicking the button. We will be prompted with which account and what password we will authenticate ourselves. And as you can see, we are prompted to for our consent. Here we can see what rights we will give to this application to access. These are the APIs that we selected when we registered our application. If I am fine with that, I will give my consent, and this is the token, the access token that we get from Azure Active Directory. The interesting things here is the last parameter. It controls the behavior because, as you see, it's also we're authenticating in an interactive way. The possible values are auto, never, always. Always means that we will always be prompted for credentials, even if we try to save them, even if there are already credentials in the token cache that we have. Never means that we will never be prompted. It's usable when we are writing some applications that it needs to authenticate against Power BI in a non-interactive way, or we don't have a user interface at all. For example, if we are writing a Windows service application. And auto is obvious. It will prompt for credentials only if needed. If these credentials are saved and available in the token cache, it will simply continue. So we said that it still performs the authentication in an interactive way. This is not convenient if, for example, we want to automate some things. If we are saying to our DBA that he will have to wait for the nightly ETL process to complete and to be prompted for credentials, this guy won't be happy. So what we can do in this case, instead of calling the acquire token async method, there is a different way. We can call acquire token silent, acquire token by passing the credentials, our username and password. So in this way, we will not be prompted for that. To make this work, first we need to try to acquire token silent from the cache. And if it doesn't exist, then we are acquiring the token by passing the username and password as a user password credential to the service. And in this case, we should get our token, access token, without any user interaction. But let me show you something. Now we are passing the username and password programmatically, and we are trying to authenticate ourselves. Remember that when we tried to authenticate the first time, we were asked for our consent. Can we, do we allow this application to access these APIs? When you're doing this programmatically, you are not able to get any prompt for consent. So you must do this from the Azure Active Directory, where you can get a list of your applications registrations. And here is the application that we created today. We pick settings and require permissions. Here is the list of permissions that are required, and we're picking grant permissions, clicking on it. Okay, now our applications has been granted with permissions to access these APIs, and if everything works correctly, let's try again. Is it the same application with 1B3? Did I grant it to the right application? 1B with, no, this is another application. 1B, this is the right one. Sorry for the confusion. Required permissions, Power BI service, grant permissions, yes. Let's try again. Okay, now we have our access token. And this is the way how you can grant permissions to an application that will authenticate itself in a non-interactive way. This way, we can use a fully automated way of authenticating and communicating with the Power BI REST API. Let me show you something else. This is our token. If you're interested in what it looks like, we can copy it and go to gwt.io, paste the token that we copied, and it will be decoded. For example, you can see here that it is for analysis Windows Net Power BI API. For this URL, this is the resource that is protected with this token. And you can see, for example, the rights that we're giving with this token. Okay, let's continue with our demo. Now we have our token. How we can use it in something useful? For example, let's start with something simple. We will make a simple application that will list data sets in particular group. The authentication code is the same as before. We're checking the cache for available tokens, or providing the username and password and acquiring a new token. But after we obtain successfully the token, we will make our first call to the API. The API endpoints looks like this. There are two types of endpoints. Depending on, we will make a call for resources in particular group, in which case you have to provide the groups and the ID of the group. Or if you're interested in features that are located, resources located in your personal My Workspace, then you can miss the groups and the ID of the group. Then we are constructing a web request to this endpoint. In this case, we'll use a get method, providing the content type. And here is how we are using our access token that we get from the Azure Active Directory. We just have to add it to our request headers. Then we're making the actual request, reading the response, and in this case, we'll just show the response to the user. Let's try to see, will this work? Okay, we're making the request to the API, and here is the result that we get. This is the list of data sets that are located in our workspace. 1, 2, 3 data sets. 1, 2, 3 data sets. Okay, great. Next thing, we have a list of data sets now. Why don't we try to push some rows to them? How we can do this? This is done by the rows operation. Again, we're authenticating ourselves to the API, but this time we will try to add rows. The endpoint address is a bit different now. In addition to the group where the dataset is located, we also need to specify the exact dataset that we will add rows to it, and in which table of this dataset we will add rows. So these are the group's ID, the dataset ID, and the name of the table, which constructs the endpoint address for our call. We are constructing the web request, but this time, because we will post some data to the service, our method will be post instead of get. We are adding our access token to request headers, and we need to provide some JSON with the rows that we want to push to the table. If you ever tried to write JSON in C# and to encode and escape all these quotes in the string, it's an awful thing. So we'll define this as anonymous type named rows, and it will has one array which will contains the actual raw data that we want to push to our table. Then we will serialize this object to a JSON and put this JSON string to the content of our request. Let's try to add this to the table. Here's the result of our operation. Sorry, the wrong project. We want to run the add rows project. Okay, we are authenticating ourselves and trying to push rows. However, this is some error that we get. The problem is that if you pay attention, the dataset that we're trying to push data to it is not doesn't has API access. This is one property of the dataset when you list, when we get the result from the previous demo, when we get a list of datasets, it's called @rows API enabled, and it was false. Currently, if you create your report in Power BI desktop and publish it to the Power BI service, these datasets will not have this API enabled. The current way, the only way to enable this API for particular dataset is to create it programmatically using the the service itself. And if this error 404 is not clear enough, the response content is explaining to us that the dataset that we are trying to push data to it is not push API enabled dataset. So what we have to do, as you heard, we need to create our dataset programmatically using the API itself. Let's do this. Again, authenticating ourselves in the same way, but this time we'll try to create a dataset. The endpoint is the same that we used last time to obtain a list of datasets, but now we will post data to it. And we are adding our access token to the header, and we need to define the structure of our dataset. I will take the chance and make the things a bit more complex here by normalizing the data for our orders, by splitting the data into two separate tables. One table for customers that will have rows customer ID and customer name, and one table for orders that will have rows customer ID, order date, and amount. This will allow me to show you how you can define relationships between tables in a dataset. These are like foreign keys that Power BI will use to apply filters when you select some value in a slicer to filter the data in the other table, and stuff like that. This is something new for version 2 of the REST API, because in the old version 1, it was only possible to define and create datasets only with a list of tables and list of columns in them. Creating relationships and measures wasn't possible, which fortunately is possible now with the version 2 of the API. Okay, so we will serialize the definition of the dataset as a JSON. We will show how it would look like. Again, put this as a content of our request and call the API. Let's try to see. Okay, this is the JSON file, how the definition of the dataset looks like. We will send this to the API, and hopefully we will get a useful result from this operation. Okay, now our dataset has been created. Let's try to find it. This is our new orders API dataset that just appeared. And as you can see, the API access of this dataset is push. This means that we can push the rows to this dataset. Let's try to do it. Okay, this time we will push rows to two different tables, authenticating ourselves, obtaining the access token, and adding rows. First, we'll add rows to customers table, and we will add 4 rows there. Then we will add rows to the orders table, which will be these 4 rows. And then we are calling our method add rows to table twice, specifying to which group, which dataset, which table, and what rows to add there. As you can see, the endpoint is constructed by specifying these things, serializing the rows that we want to add to this table, and eventually we will add rows to our table. Let's try. Authenticating ourselves. Okay. Sorry. I forgot to get the dataset of the ID of the new dataset to use it in my demo. Of course, we need to specify in which exactly dataset we want to push. So this is the group ID, and I will put the API, the unique identifier of the newly created datasets that I just made. Let's try again. And okay, we have our rows added twice. Okay, let's try to see, do we have these rows? These are the tables that are found in our dataset. And for example, if you want to add the customer name, here is the content. So we have the rows added to our dataset. Probably now is the right time to mention a few limitations that this API has. First, you can have up to 75 columns in your tables. You can have up to 75 tables in one dataset. You can add up to 10,000 rows in a table with a single post request, but no more than 1 million rows per hour per one dataset. So this is the limit that you will get for pushing data to the service. Also, you should not exceed the limit of 120 post requests per minute. So you can't just calling this API constantly. You have some limits. Also, one table can contain up to 5 million rows. You cannot exceed this limit. And as with many other databases like SQL Server, your data types cannot exceed, your string columns cannot exceed 4,000 characters. It's like defining nvarchar type in SQL Server. And at last, one post request cannot exceed 16 megabytes in size. For streaming dataset, this limit is much lower, is 15 kilobytes, but I will talk about streaming datasets later in this presentation. Okay, we said that we need to create our datasets programmatically. But doesn't this mean that we must stop using Power BI desktop for authoring our reports? How will we design our reports? First, you can create a report online. As you can see, I just click it on my dataset here and start adding visuals. But this isn't the best way, the most convenient way. People often use it when they have to make a report not from their computer, but from some other computer where they don't have Power BI installed, or in case there is no Power BI desktop application for your operating system, for example, macOS or Linux. But you are not limited to this. You still can use Power BI desktop to author your reports. But in this case, when you're getting data, you should not go to your data source directly, but for example, your database or text file or whatever, you can go with for Power BI service, connect to Power BI service directly. And okay, it wants me to create a new report because I cannot combine data with the existing report. But there you can see a list of workspaces that you have. And when you select a workspace, you will see a list of datasets in this workspace. So you can pick your newly created datasets from there, and you will get the data from it. This is the way how you can share a single dataset between multiple reports. You can create one model which you can feed programmatically with data and create as many reports as you want using this particular dataset only. Okay. And as I would like to wrap up the demos regarding calling the APIs with one thing that I found particularly interesting. This is how we can work with parameters and refreshing datasets in the service. For example, imagine a scenario like this. You have a retail application, you're registering a new reseller, and you have a template workspace with reports that you will copy for every single reseller that you have. So you will copy these reports from the template workspace to a newly created workspace, which you can authorize your reseller to have access to. Update the values of the parameters to be the unique identifier of this newly created reseller, and you have a set of reports ready for your partner waiting for him to be used. So what we are doing in this case, we'll get our dataset by his name. We'll get the dataset ID, the unique identifier of this dataset. Then we'll set some parameters name, the value of this parameter, the customer name. We'll change the value of this parameter to this value, and then we will refresh the dataset. This is one report that I prepared in advance, which is here. As you can see, it contains the same data for our 4 customers, but I filtered the data to show only the values, the rows regarding customer 1. And I also pinned this to a dashboard. I will tell you in a moment why. So we have our report here where we can edit the parameters. As you can see, the current value of the customer name parameter is customer 1. This report uses a data source in Azure, so we will try to change the value of the parameter and reward the data for this report. First, we will list the dataset, get the ID value of the dataset with our name that we specify. Then we will use the API to change the value of some parameter, in which case we have to pass a JSON string with parameter name and the new parameter value. And then we have to refresh the datasets to get the data regarding the matching the new parameters value. Okay, let's try to do this. First, I would like to show you dashboard, and we'll authenticate ourselves. Fingers crossed. Okay. And okay, the dataset has been refreshed. and the data has been refreshed automatically in our dashboard to show the data for customer 2. This happened because the tile has been pinned to our dashboard. If we have been here in our report, as you can see, it still shows the data for the old parameter value. We must refresh the report automatically to reflect the changes in parameters value. But for dashboards, the tiles are updated automatically, which is quite useful for reflecting real-time data changes. Okay, let's continue with our slides. We saw in our demo how we can acquire access tokens for authenticating against the Azure Active Directory. We can do this by calling acquire token async or acquire token silent async methods. We saw the different behavior that we can get with these methods. We saw how we can create dataset and use dataset operations. We saw how we can use the whole operations and what are the limitations of this API. And also we saw how we can share a single dataset between multiple reports and how we can create dataset programmatically and use it in our reports. I would like also to mention some other possibilities that the REST API gives you. One of these is update table schema. We provided a table schema when we created our dataset. The REST API also gives you the option to update the table schema of existing dataset, but you should always go for it with extra caution, especially if you have many rows in this dataset. For example, renaming a column isn't possible if you provide the same schema, but only with one column name changed. This will be treated as dropping the existing column and adding a new one, which may not be what you expect. So in general, my advice is don't do this. It is possible, but try to avoid it as much as you can. Just create a new data set, push the data to it, and drop the old one. This is to try to avoid some unpleasant surprises that you may get. Few more words regarding the refreshing of datasets. Obviously, you cannot refresh any dataset. Refreshing dataset do make sense when these are imported datasets. It doesn't make much sense to refresh a direct query live connection dataset. Also, the Power BI service needs to be able to connect to the data source where the data exists. So either you have to put your data in a database in the cloud in Azure, for example, or you have to provide a gateway installed on your premises, and this gateway must be configured for your dataset so you can refresh it. You can understand these things from the properties of the dataset. It will tell you, is it refreshable at all, or is it a gateway required to do the refresh? Also, you should know that you are limited to 8 refreshes of a dataset per day, per 24 hours. If this isn't enough for you, you can go for Power BI Premium, where this limit is higher, but this is quite expensive solution. So keep this in mind when you design your applications. Okay, I would like to mention something more about creating the dataset. First, the dataset that you create has something called a retention policy. Retention policy is something that defines how the dataset behaves when you're pushing rows to it. If you don't specify a retention policy, it's none, it's the default. In this case, the dataset will behave as a normal table from a database. It will keep all the rows that you push to it, but there is a limit, as I said before, of 5 million rows. If you try to push more data, your request will fail. However, if you create your dataset with basic FIFO retention policy, this will create a queue in which you can hold up to 20,000 records. When you're pushing more and more records to these datasets, to this table, once the number of rows exceeds this number significantly, in the documentation they say that it can reach up to 210,000 records. Once the number of rows exceeds this value, the oldest records will be deleted from the queue automatically by the service. This way you can keep pushing rows to the table without taking care of cleaning up the old data. This is useful because if it's a normal data set, the API doesn't provide you a way to delete some of the rows. The API can delete all of the rows from your table. You cannot give it a filter which rows to be deleted. So essentially, it can only truncate your table. So if you want to create an application that constantly pushes data to a table, probably this basic FIFO retention policy is a valid option for you. The second interesting thing that I would like to mention about creating a dataset is that the dataset has something called a mode. When you create a dataset from Power BI desktop application, the dataset you get has an as on-premise mode. I will not talk about the Azure datasets. These are the live connections to Azure analysis services, but this is beyond the scope of the current presentations. So I will focus on the rest of the three modes. The interesting one that we created just a few minutes ago is a push dataset. This is a dataset that is enabled, the API is enabled, and we can push rows to it. The other option is the streaming dataset. The streaming datasets are something like a lightweight version of the datasets. They are optimized for holding the real-time data. When you create a push dataset, the service creates under the hood a database dedicated for this dataset to hold the data for it. For streaming datasets, there is no such database created. They are holding their data only in memory and hold the data for last hour only. So the data older than 1 hour is automatically deleted. You can create a service dataset, a streaming dataset, sorry, by going to your dashboard, datasets, and create streaming dataset. you can choose how you will feed data to these data sets. In case you pick the API and click next, this is a data set that you can push data using the Power BI REST API. So how data set will be named, CPU, for example. Here is something that I created as example, CPU, what, and you can define the structure, the schema of the data set. Data time, for example, which is data time, and CPU what, which is a number. This is the structure of your data set. When you create it, you will get a link of an endpoint that you can post data directly to this data set. I wrote one Windows service application, which I just run it, that constantly pushes information about the CPU world of my computer to one such streaming data set. Here is the information from last hour, and this was the period of time that my service application didn't work yet. And now you can see the current world of my workstation, that it is about 50% or something. This is a tile that is behind it is a streaming data set. As I said before, there is no database created behind the scenes for holding the data of these streaming data sets. This is the reason that you cannot use this streaming data set in reports, because report will need a database as a data source to get the data from. However, when you create the streaming data set, the only option you have is to pin it as a tile in the dashboard. This is what I've done here. You have various options to create a chart, a table, but in this case, in this example, it makes most sense to be a chart. This is the source of the service application. You will get it. But the idea is that every few seconds I have a thread that every 5 seconds posts the value of some performance counter to the service, to this endpoint. The interesting thing to note here is that in this case, you don't need the authorization token at all. Everything, the authorization is encoded in the URL. Okay, so you may ask, is this the right way for interacting with the Power BI REST API? Because we're doing raw API calls. Isn't there a better way of doing it? Yes, Microsoft released official SDK, which you can download and start using for making these API calls, but you'll see that it's not very convenient, at least not for me. First, you need to authenticate yourself. It's done the same way. However, later you instantiate an object from this Power BI client class, and you can use methods and classes from this library to interact with the REST API. For example, here is how I'll get a list of datasets in one particular group. I will print their names and ID values. Then I will use the classes column, table, and dataset to create a new dataset in this group. And I will push some rows information to this dataset. Let's see, does it works? Okay. CPU what? is the dataset that we have with this ID, orders with this ID, orders API created from us, parameters demo. This is the list of datasets that we get, and our dataset has been created. This is orders SDK dataset has been just created, and we're pushing some rows to it. This is how this API has been used. As you can see, the rows, the dataset contains the rows that we push it. However, the problem that I have is that this API, the SDK, is all fully documented. Here is what you get. Only a list of methods, list of classes, no samples, no explanation, nothing at all. Another option that you have is to use alternative SDKs or Power BI clients. For example, one created by one Austrian guy named Gerhard. I remember, I forgot his last name, but the links are provided in my slides. And another option that you have to interact with the REST API is, of course, to use PowerShell. If you are trying to use PowerShell, of course, you have to install some modules. In this case, Microsoft Power BI Management module. We have to authenticate yourself against the service. Okay, let's do this. And you get a list of reports, for example, in one workspace. You get a list of datasets in another workspace. You are getting one particular dataset, you are finding it by name and trying to push rows to it. However, as you can see, the add Power BI rows commandlet is not available yet. This is something very new. It was released about 2 weeks ago by the latest version. And one Japanese guy, Kinichiro Nakamura, is the one who contributed these commandlets for working with the datasets, tables, and rows. And he is currently working on the add Power BI rows commandlet. But as I see, this is the latest version, which was published 17 days ago. We're waiting for the new version to come out to be able to use this API, but just keep in mind that PowerShell is also an option to use. This is everything I can give you for now. These are some links that I provided, and if you have any questions, thank you for your attention. It's now your turn. I'm listening. Is there any questions? Jan?
So far there are no questions yet. So
nobody understood nothing. Okay, next time I should do it better.
It was pretty clear actually, but I suppose people have to try it for themselves. For me too, it's something you just have to try out, and just if you have any questions, ask them then. But it's a good primer for people to just see this working and to know how it can actually work, how they can use it. So thank you for that.
Yes, it was a real pleasure for me to be here. Thank you. I will how to send you the source code and the slide for this demo, so you can post them somewhere probably.
You'll be receiving an email shortly where I have a Dropbox link, and I'll be gathering all the presentations of the live event and this event together so that people can actually access them. And I'll be posting the link for the attendees up on meetup.com on our page.
Great.
Good?
Yeah.
Well, thank you again, and see you next time.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend. Get some rest. Thank you again.
Bye. Yes. See you later.
Bye-bye.